The sky over Hyrule Field had been clear an hour ago. Zelda remembered that clearly, the particular gold of late afternoon light falling across the grass near the ruins where she and Link had been investigating a strange resonance in the old stone. One moment the world had been ordinary, sunlit, familiar down to the smell of crushed grass and the distant call of a hawk. The next, the air had folded in on itself like paper crumpled by an invisible fist, and the Triforce mark on the back of her hand had burned with a heat she hadn't felt since the days of Calamity Ganon. Now there was no gold light. There was green, an unbroken oppressive green, the kind that came from a canopy so thick it swallowed the sun whole. The air was wrong too, heavier, damper, carrying smells that didn't belong to any forest she knew. Rot and something colder beneath the rot, like the inside of a tomb that had never once been opened to fresh air. Zelda. Link's voice was low, controlled, but she'd known him long enough to hear the edge underneath it. He had the Master Sword half drawn already, his eyes tracking the tree line in slow, deliberate arcs. This isn't Hyrule, I know. She pressed her palm flat against her own hand, feeling the Triforce still warm beneath her skin, a low, steady pulse like a second heartbeat. The mark reacted before we moved. Whatever pulled us here, it was drawn to this. She didn't finish the thought. She didn't need to. In 18 years of carrying the weight of the goddess's gift, Zelda had learned that when the Triforce reacted unprompted, it was rarely to something small. They started walking because standing still in unfamiliar territory had killed better warriors than either of them. The forest closed around them, ancient and silent in a way that felt deliberate, not the comfortable quiet of the Korok forest, but a stillness that seemed to be listening. Twice Zelda caught herself glancing over her shoulder at nothing, certain she'd felt eyes on her back. Link noticed her doing it and said nothing, but he shifted half a step closer, angling his body between her and the deeper shadows. It was the corpses that told them the truth first. They found the remains scattered at the edge of a burned clearing, what had clearly once been a hunting party, judging by the ruined bows and the rusted heads of arrows still lodged in splintered wood. But the bodies themselves were wrong, not killed by blade or beast in any way Link recognized. The skin had been drained to a gray, papery husk, faces frozen in expressions of a terror so total it had outlasted death itself. No blood, no wounds. Just husks arranged with an almost casual disregard, as though whatever had done this hadn't considered the act worth lingering over. Link crouched beside one of the bodies, his jaw tight. This wasn't a monster. Monsters don't leave things this clean, Zelda agreed quietly. This was deliberate, and whoever did it wasn't hiding the evidence. They wanted it found. That was when the horn sounded, 3 long, mournful notes rolling out over the trees from somewhere to the east, followed by the unmistakable rhythm of marching feet, dozens of them moving in disciplined formation. Link was on his feet instantly, sword fully drawn now, positioning himself in front of Zelda without a word needing to pass between them. Years of partnership had made the motion instinctive. What emerged from the tree line was not a Hyrulean patrol. The soldiers wore black lacquered armor, banners bearing a sigil neither of them recognized, a stylized skull wreathed in something that might have been thorns or might have been flame. Their formation was inhumanly precise, and as they drew closer, Zelda realized with a cold jolt that not all of them were breathing. Several of the figures at the formation's edges moved with the jerking, wrong-jointed gait of the dead reanimated, their eye sockets glowing faint and sourceless. Soldier at the head of the column, clearly human, clearly in command, raised a gauntleted hand, and the entire formation halted as one. Identify yourselves. His voice carried easily across the clearing, flat and used to being obeyed. You stand in territory claimed by the Sorcerer King of Nazarick. Trespass here is answered with death, unless you can offer a reason it should be otherwise. Zelda stepped forward before Link could object, years of diplomatic instinct overriding the instinct to hide. Better to speak first on her own terms than to be spoken for. We are not trespassers by choice, she said, keeping her voice level, projecting the calm authority she'd cultivated across a decade of court politics. We arrived here through means neither of us understands or controls. We seek no conflict with your king or his lands. The commander's eyes narrowed, sweeping over her traveling clothes, then over Link's sword and shield, lingering she noticed on the faint golden glow still pulsing at the back of her hand. Something in his expression shifted, a calculation happening behind otherwise disciplined features. Foreign mana signature, he said, not quite to her, more to the officer beside him. Unregistered, possibly extraplanar. A pause. The Sorcerer King will want to know of this personally. We're not looking for an audience with your king, Link said, his grip tightening on the Master Sword. We're looking for a way home. That, the commander replied with the faint, humorless precision of someone quoting policy rather than opinion, is not your decision to make. Come peacefully and you will be treated according to the laws of hospitality. Resist, and you will be treated according to the laws governing hostile trespass." He gestured, and the ranks behind him shifted subtly, weapons not drawn but clearly ready to be. "The choice, such as it is yours." Zelda felt Link's tension radiating beside her, the barely restrained instinct of a hero raised to meet threats with steel. She put a hand lightly on his arm, a small gesture, but one that carried the weight of every battle they'd fought together, every time restraint had proven wiser than the sword. "We'll come," she said, peacefully. "But I expect the courtesy to be returned." Commander's mouth twitched at the corner, something that might have been amusement in a face otherwise built for command. "Courtesy," he echoed, "is not typically extended to the uninvited, but mana of your caliber earns consideration." He turned, boots striking the packed earth in a single sharp motion. "Move." They walked for hours through a forest that seemed to grow darker and older with every mile, until the trees finally broke apart to reveal something that made Zelda's breath catch despite every instinct telling her to remain composed. A city vast, black-spired, alive with torchlight and movement, built in a style that owed nothing to any architecture she'd studied. And beyond it, rising from the earth like a wound the world had never healed, an enormous fortress of dark stone and jagged towers, its silhouette blotting out a portion of the darkening sky itself. "Nazarick," the commander said, following her gaze with something that sounded almost like pride. "The seat of the Sorcerer King's power, you should feel honored. Few outsiders are permitted to see it and live to speak of the privilege." Link's hand found the hilt of the Master Sword again, an old habit surfacing under pressure. "Comforting." Zelda said nothing, but she was watching the fortress with an entirely different kind of attention, the attention of someone who had spent her life sensing power, weighing it, measuring what it might mean for the safety of everyone she loved. And what she felt radiating from that structure was unlike anything she had encountered in Hyrule. Not the raw, ancient malice of Calamity Ganon, something colder, something organized. Something that felt less like a force of destruction and more like the product of design, deliberate, layered, and utterly without mercy for anyone who hadn't earned a place within its walls. The Triforce mark on her hand pulsed harder as they drew closer, a warmth that had shifted subtly into something closer to alarm. They were led not into the fortress itself, but into a fortified encampment at its base, clearly a garrison of some kind, staffed by more of the black-armored soldiers, and disturbingly several creatures that defied easy categorization. A skeletal figure in ornate mage's robes drifted past without acknowledging them, muttering incantations under its breath. Something vast and insectal moved in the shadows between two towers, visible only as a shifting darkness against darkness. Zelda kept her expression neutral through sheer force of will, cataloging threats the way her father had taught her, the way a queen learns to read a room full of enemies who haven't yet decided whether to be enemies. They were brought to a chamber lit by strange, cold flames that gave off no smoke, and left under guard while word was sent, the commander implied, though didn't quite say, to someone considerably higher in the fortress's hierarchy. Someone, Zelda gathered, who did not typically concern himself personally with wandering trespassers, but who would very likely make an exception for two travelers carrying a mana signature unlike anything cataloged in his domain. "Zelda." Link's voice was quiet, meant only for her once the guards had withdrawn to a respectful distance. "We need a plan if this Sorcerer King decides we're a threat. We survive by being useful before we're threatening," she said, matching his tone. "That's how it's always worked. We listen, we learn what this place values, what it fears, before we decide whether to fight or negotiate. If it's already decided we're worth taking apart to see what makes us work." Zelda didn't have an answer for that, not one she was willing to say aloud. Instead, she looked down at her own hand, at the golden triangle still glowing faintly beneath her skin, and thought of every legend she'd ever been taught about the price of power desired by those who hadn't been chosen to carry it. Whatever waited for them deeper in that black fortress, she suspected, was about to become very, very interested in exactly that question. The chamber's cold flames flickered once in perfect unison, as though something far away had just taken notice. The chamber they waited in had no windows, which Zelda found more telling than anything the commander had said. A room built for holding people who might need to disappear without explanation. She cataloged the details with the same discipline she'd applied to every unfamiliar court she'd ever navigated. The black stone walls veined with something that glowed faintly violet in the dim light, the absence of any visible door mechanism, the cold flames that burned without fuel and without smoke, casting shadows that seemed to move a half-second slower than they should. Link paced. He'd stopped after the third circuit of the room when she'd given him a look, but she could still feel the restlessness radiating off him, the cold tension of a warrior denied an enemy to fight. "Testing us," she said quietly. "Leaving us alone like this, seeing what we do when we think no one's watching." "Someone's watching," Link said. He nodded toward a section of the wall where the violet veining pulsed slightly out of rhythm with the rest. "Scrying maybe, or something like it." Zelda filed that observation away. It confirmed what she'd already suspected. This was not a society that left things to chance. Everything about their capture, from the disciplined formation of the patrol to the precise wording of the commander's ultimatum, spoke of an organization built around control. Control of information, control of territory, control of outcomes. It was the opposite of the chaotic malevolence she associated with monsters, and in its own way, far more unsettling. It was hours before anyone came for them, long enough that Zelda had begun composing and discarding a dozen different approaches to whatever audience awaited. When the door finally opened, seemingly from nowhere, it wasn't the commander who entered, but someone else entirely. A woman or something wearing the shape of one, with skin the pale gray-white of moonlight on stone and eyes that held no pupils, only a soft golden glow. She wore robes of deep violet stitched with silver thread and patterns that seemed to shift when Zelda tried to focus on them directly. "I am Albedo," the woman said, her voice carrying a warmth that felt deliberately calibrated, like a diplomat's smile worn over something colder. "Guardian overseer of the great tomb of Nazarick and voice of Ainz in matters requiring delicacy." Her golden eyes moved over them both, lingering again on the faint glow still visible at Zelda's hand. "You have caused quite a stir among the higher floors. It isn't often that beings of your particular signature wander into our forest." "Didn't wander," Link said, his tone carefully controlled but firm. "We were brought here against our will through means we don't understand." "A displacement," Albedo said, as though this confirmed something she'd already suspected. "Interesting. Ainz theorized as much, given the anomalous nature of your arrival." She folded her hands before her, the picture of composed patience. "He has expressed interest in meeting you both personally. This is, I should clarify, a considerable honor. Ainz does not grant personal audiences to outsiders lightly." Zelda kept her expression neutral, though something in the phrasing set off a quiet alarm. Honor, interest. The vocabulary of hospitality wrapped around something that felt, unmistakably, like the beginning of an evaluation. "We would welcome the chance to speak with him directly," she said. "Perhaps he can help us understand how we came to be here and how we might return home." Something flickered across Albedo's expression, brief, almost imperceptible, gone before Zelda could be certain she'd seen it at all. "Ainz is generous when it suits him. Follow me, and I would advise both of you to mind your conduct. The floor guardians do not take kindly to disrespect shown toward their creator." They were led out of the holding chamber and through corridors that defied Zelda's every attempt to memorize their layout, staircases that seemed to descend further than the building's exterior height should have allowed. Halls lined with statues of creatures she had no name for, their stone eyes seeming to track the visitors as they passed. Twice they crossed paths with other inhabitants of the tomb. A towering insected figure wreathed in dark chitin that regarded them with what might have been curiosity or might have been calculation, and a pair of maids, human in shape, moving with an unnerving synchronized precision, who bowed low as Albedo passed but whose eyes, Zelda noted, never left the newcomers. "This place is a fortress built to look like a palace," Link murmured, low enough that only Zelda could hear. "Everyone we've seen so far could kill us without breaking stride." "I know," she murmured back. "Which means our value to them right now is worth more to us than our weapons." They reached at last an enormous set of doors, black iron worked with detailed reliefs depicting scenes Zelda couldn't fully parse, battles certainly and what looked like coronations, and stranger scenes still that seemed to depict beings of impossible scale looking down upon a world rendered tiny beneath them. The doors opened without any visible hand moving them, revealing a throne room of staggering scale, its vaulted ceiling lost in shadow high above, its walls lined with silent armored figures whose stillness felt less like statuary and more like patience. At the far end, upon a throne carved from black stone and inlaid with veins of glowing crimson, sat a figure that made every instinct in Zelda's body go taut with wariness. Bones. Just bones, arranged in the shape of a robed and crowned man, eye sockets burning with twin points of crimson light that seemed to hold an intelligence far too controlled, far too patient, to belong to anything as simple as an undead monster. "Ainz Albedo said, dropping into a bow so precise it looked choreographed. "The travelers, as requested." Figure on the throne regarded them for a long moment before speaking, and when he did, his voice carried a resonance that seemed to come from everywhere in the chamber at once, deep and measured. "So, the anomaly the Border Patrol reported. His crimson gaze settled on Zelda and she felt it like a physical weight and a tension that seemed to be cataloging her down to the smallest detail. Approach. I do not bite unless given reason to. Link's hand twitched toward the Master Sword, and Zelda placed a hand lightly on his arm before stepping forward herself, chin lifted, every inch the princess who had faced down calamity and lived to tell of it. I am Zelda, Princess of Hyrule, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber. This is Link, my sworn protector. We arrived in your lands through means neither of us chose or understands, and we ask only for the chance to find our way home, Hyrule. Ainz repeated the words slowly, as though testing its shape, a kingdom unknown to any record within my domain. And yet, the crimson eyes narrowed, focusing with unmistakable intensity on the back of her hand. You carry something my floor guardians have never cataloged. A mana signature unlike any item, race, or class within the New World's known parameters. Would you care to explain what precisely that is? Zelda felt the weight of the entire room's attention shift toward her hand, toward the faintly glowing triangle beneath her skin. She'd navigated enough negotiations to know when partial honesty served better than either silence or a full accounting. It is called the Triforce, she said. A relic granted by the goddesses who shaped my world. It is not a weapon, not in the conventional sense. It is closer to a mark of trust, given to those who embody courage, wisdom, or power in their truest forms. Something shifted in the throne room's atmosphere at that, a stillness that felt different from the patient quiet before, sharper, more focused. Ainz leaned forward slightly, the movement of bone against black robes unnervingly silent. A relic granted directly by divine authority, he said, and for the first time Zelda heard something beneath the measured calm of his voice, an eagerness carefully leashed but unmistakably present. Not crafted, not looted, bestowed. Tell me, princess, does this Triforce respond only to you, or could its nature be studied? Link stepped forward before Zelda could answer, placing himself half a pace ahead of her, the Master Sword's hilt gleaming faintly under the chamber's crimson light. She's not an experiment, he said, his voice hard. Whatever you're used to dealing with here, understand that now. Temperature in the room seemed to drop, though nothing physical had changed. Several of the armored figures along the walls shifted, subtle and synchronized, weapons not drawn but clearly a heartbeat from being so. Albedo's composed expression flickered into something closer to alarm, her eyes darting between Link and her king. Ainz raised one skeletal hand, and the room stilled instantly, guardians relaxing back into their patient watchfulness as though a switch had been thrown. Peace, he said, and though the word was simple, it carried the absolute authority of someone entirely unaccustomed to being disobeyed. I have made no threat, hero, I am merely curious. It has been a long time since anything within this world has genuinely surprised me. A pause, and Zelda thought she caught beneath the hollow sockets and ancient authority something almost wistful. Curiosity, in my experience, is best pursued through cooperation rather than conflict. Threaten what interests me, and you will find it withdrawn from your reach entirely. Cooperate, and you may find Nazarick's resources considerably more useful than its dungeons. Zelda studied him carefully, weighing the offer against everything her instincts were screaming at her. There was something genuinely strange about this Sorcerer King, a figure of clearly monstrous power who spoke with the careful diplomatic calculation of a scholar, who seemed less interested in immediate conquest than in understanding. It didn't make him safe. It made him, if anything, more dangerous, because power paired with patience and curiosity was a far more difficult thing to outmaneuver than raw, mindless malice. We have no interest in becoming subjects of study, she said carefully. But we're not opposed to an exchange of knowledge if it serves both our interests. You understand this world. We understand nothing about it. If your people could help us understand the nature of what brought us here and perhaps how to reverse it, we would be willing to share what we can about the nature of the Triforce within reason. A long silence followed, the crimson eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle even from across the chamber's considerable length. Within reason, Ainz echoed, and there was something that might have been amusement in the words, dry and ancient. A diplomat's phrase, princess, and a wise one. Very well, you will be granted guest status within Nazarick, a privilege I assure you rarely extended to outsiders of any caliber. Albedo will see to your comfort and your education regarding this world's nature. In exchange, I trust you will indulge my curiosity regarding your Triforce, within whatever limits your reason dictates. Albedo's bow this time carried a note of something Zelda couldn't quite place, pride, perhaps, or anticipation. It will be done, Ainz Sama. More matter, Ainz said, as Albedo began to usher them toward the chamber's edge. His gaze had settled back on Zelda with renewed focus. The manner of your arrival. A displacement of this nature, a rift capable of transporting beings and relics across what I presume to be an entirely separate world, is not a phenomenon I have encountered in my centuries of study. If such a rift exists and could theoretically be replicated or reversed, he let the thought trail, but its implications settled over the room with unmistakable weight. You understand, I trust, why that possibility interests me a great deal. Zelda felt a chill that had nothing to do with the throne room's cold flames. Whatever careful cooperation they'd just negotiated, one truth had crystallized with absolute clarity in that moment. Ainz Ooal was not merely curious about the Triforce as an artifact. He was curious about the door it might represent, a door to worlds beyond his own and the power that might be gathered from them. As they were led from the throne room, Link leaned close, his voice barely a whisper. "He's not going to help us go home. He's going to try to keep the door open." "I know," Zelda murmured back, glancing once more at her own glowing hand before the throne room's doors closed behind them with a sound like a verdict being sealed. "Which means we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with before he understands exactly what we're carrying." Behind them, in the vast dark chamber, Ainz Ooal remained motionless upon his throne for a long while after the doors had shut, crimson eyes fixed on the space where the golden light had lingered, already calculating 100 possibilities that had nothing to do with hospitality at all. Nazarick did not sleep. Zelda learned this within her first hour in the guest quarters Albedo had arranged for them, chambers of startling opulence, all black marble and violet silk, that felt less like hospitality and more like a gilded cage designed to remind its occupants exactly how far from home and how thoroughly outmatched they were. Through the tall arched window she could see movement in the courtyards below at all hours. Patrols marching in perfect synchrony, robed figures crossing between towers on errands she couldn't guess at, and once unmistakably something enormous unfolding leathery wings against the moonlight before vanishing back into shadow. "You should rest," Link said, though he made no move toward the ornate bed himself. He'd taken up a position near the window instead, the master sword resting across his knees, his eyes tracking the courtyard's movement with the patient vigilance of a soldier who didn't trust a single stone of the walls around them. "I don't think either of us is sleeping tonight," Zelda said. She sat at the room's writing desk, turning her hand over slowly, watching the Triforce mark pulse faint and steady beneath her skin. "Not until we understand more of what we're dealing with." They didn't have to wait long. Just past what Zelda judged to be midnight, a soft knock preceded the arrival of one of the maidservants she'd seen in the corridors earlier, silver-haired, doll-like in her precision, introducing herself only as Narbarul Gamma, one of Ain't Sama's personal attendants, sent to answer whatever questions the guests might have within permitted bounds. Her tone carried an edge of barely concealed contempt that made Zelda suspect the assignment had been given as something closer to a punishment than an honor. It was through Narbarul, grudging, clipped, but ultimately unable to resist correcting what she clearly considered ignorance, that they began to piece together the true shape of the world they'd fallen into. The new world, she called it, though she seemed to know little of how it had come to be, only that it existed now as a patchwork of human kingdoms, beastmen tribes, and demi-human nations, all of them living in the shadow of powers far greater than themselves. Powers like Nazarick. Ain't Sama did not conquer this land through cruelty for its own sake, Narbarul said, with the clipped precision of someone reciting doctrine rather than opinion. He conquered it because the alternative, leaving it in the hands of the weak, the corrupt, the short-sighted, was worse. The Sorcerer Kingdom does not tolerate banditry. It does not tolerate the abuse of the poor by nobility grown fat on inherited privilege. Where Ain't Sama rules, order prevails. Where he does not, chaos festers as it always has. The people who resisted that order, Link asked, his voice carefully neutral, though Zelda could hear the edge beneath it. "The villages we passed on the way here, the dead." Narbarul's expression didn't so much as flicker. "Enemies of the Sorcerer Kingdom are dealt with according to their crimes. I would advise against mistaking necessary severity for indiscriminate cruelty, hero. Ain't Sama's justice is absolute, but it is not without reason." It was a careful answer, Zelda thought, and a telling one, the kind of loyalty that had clearly been earned rather than simply demanded, but which nonetheless glossed over exactly the kind of moral complexity that made her deeply uneasy. She thought of the husks they'd found in the forest, drained and discarded, and wondered exactly how many necessary severities had built the order Narbarul spoke of with such conviction. Over the following days, they were given what Albedo termed the freedom of the tomb, A carefully curated tour of Nazarick's upper floors, accompanied always by at least one guardian or high-ranking attendant, ostensibly for their protection, though Zelda understood the arrangement for what it truly was, a leash disguised as courtesy. They were shown gardens tended by beings that defied natural law, libraries containing tomes and languages that predated the New World's oldest human kingdoms, training grounds where soldiers sparred against constructs of terrifying capability. Every hallway, every chamber seemed engineered to communicate a single unmistakable message: you are guests here only because we permit it. It was on the third day that Zelda first met Shaltir, Bloodfallen guardian of the first to third floors, a vampire of terrible beauty and terrible power, who greeted the newcomers with a curiosity that felt distinctly more predatory than Albedo's careful diplomacy. She circled them slowly during their introduction, crimson eyes lingering on Zelda's hand with open hunger. "So this is the one Ainz Sama has taken such an interest in," Shaltir said, her voice a purring drawl. "A mortal carrying divine mana, how delicious." Her gaze flicked to Link, assessing him with a different kind of interest entirely. "And the hero, tell me, swordsman, how does it feel knowing your blade is nothing here, a toy sword in a world of true monsters?" Link's expression didn't change, though Zelda felt the tension coil tighter in his shoulders. "The Master Sword has cut down gods before," he said evenly. "I wouldn't call it a toy." Something flickered in Shaltir's expression, surprise perhaps, or the first flush of genuine interest rather than performative menace. "Gods," she repeated. "How interesting. Perhaps you're not entirely beneath notice after all." It was a small exchange, but it told Zelda something important. Whatever Link's blade lacked in raw magical output compared to the terrors of Nazarick, the legend behind it, the weight of what it had accomplished, carried its own kind of currency in a world that clearly respected power above almost everything else. She filed the observation away, another small piece in the larger puzzle of how two travelers with no magic system compatible with this world's rules might yet carve out a place for themselves that wasn't simply curiosity or asset. That evening, Albedo requested Zelda's presence alone, a summons that made Link visibly uneasy, though he'd been firmly, if politely, refused entry when he attempted to accompany her. Zelda was led not to the throne room this time, but to a smaller, more intimate chamber, its walls lined with shelves of scrolls and strange devices whose purpose she couldn't begin to guess. Ainz was already there, seated behind a wide desk, his skeletal fingers steepled in a gesture that felt almost thoughtful despite his lack of expression. "Princess Zelda," he said, gesturing to a chair across from him, "please, I find myself curious about your world beyond the matter of your Triforce." Humor and old scholars' questions? There was something in his tone, a genuine, careful courtesy that made Zelda reconsider, if only slightly, the purely predatory read she'd initially given him. She took the offered seat, keeping her posture composed, alert. "I'll answer what I can." Their conversation ranged further than she'd expected, not merely into the mechanics of the Triforce, though he circled back to that topic more than once with barely concealed eagerness, but into the nature of Hyrule itself, its history of cyclical calamity and renewal, the concept of reincarnating heroes bound by destiny to face a recurring evil. The idea of gods who granted power not through contracts or systems, but through pure unearned trust in a chosen bloodline's character. A world where power is granted based on inherent virtue, rather than earned through study, cultivation, or conquest, Ainz mused, more to himself than to her. That is a fascinating inefficiency, and yet apparently a stable one, given the survival of your kingdom across what you describe as centuries of cyclical threat. He paused, crimson eyes fixed on her with unsettling intensity. "Tell me, princess, have you never resented it, being chosen not for what you achieved, but for what you were before you had any say in the matter?" The question caught her off guard with its precision, cutting closer to old, private doubts than she'd expected from a being she'd known for mere days. "There were years I resented it," she admitted, surprising herself with her own honesty. "Years I felt like a vessel for something greater than myself, rather than a person in my own right, but I've come to understand that the gift doesn't erase who I am beneath it. It amplifies whatever is already there, for better or worse." Generous interpretation, Ainz said, though I wonder if it is entirely accurate or simply the interpretation that allows you to bear the weight more easily. He leaned back slightly, an oddly human gesture from a being of bone and ancient magic. "I understand something of what it means to become more than what you once were, princess. Whether that becoming was a gift or a burden remains, even now, a question I have not entirely answered for myself." It was, Zelda realized with some surprise, the first genuinely vulnerable thing she'd heard him say, a crack in the careful, measured authority he wore like armor, revealing something underneath that felt less like a monster calculating advantage and more like a being genuinely uncertain of his own nature. She filed the observation away alongside everything else, uncertain yet what to make of it, but recognizing its value all the same. Every negotiation had a human element, even perhaps especially when the negotiator wasn't human at all. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a messenger, one of the more unsettling constructs Zelda had encountered in the tomb, a floating orb of shifting light that delivered its report in a burst of images and impressions rather than words. Ainz's posture shifted subtly as he received it, something in his bearing sharpening. "It seems," he said, rising from his seat, "that your arrival has not gone unnoticed beyond Nazarick's walls. The Slane Theocracy's intelligence network has picked up rumors of a foreign artifact of significant power, currently housed within the Sorcerer Kingdom's borders." He turned toward her, and though his face was incapable of true expression, something in his stillness felt distinctly grim. "The Theocracy does not share my patience for careful study, Princess. Where I am curious, they are inquisitive and considerably less concerned with the well-being of whatever or whoever stands between them and a relic of divine origin." Zelda felt a chill that had nothing to do with the chamber's temperature. "You're saying we've become a target?" "I am saying," Ainz corrected, "that you were already a target the moment word of the Triforce left Nazarick's walls, which, given the nature of intelligence networks in this world, was likely within hours of your arrival. The only question now is who reaches you first and under what terms." He studied her for a long moment. "I would advise remaining within Nazarick's protection until this matter is better understood." "Not," he added with what might have been dry humor, "purely out of altruism, I'll admit, but the offer stands regardless of my motives." She returned to their quarters with the weight of that conversation settling heavily over her, and found Link waiting exactly where she'd left him, tension radiating off him despite his attempt at composure. "Well," he asked the moment the door closed behind her. She told him everything, the conversation's unexpected turns, the vulnerability she'd glimpsed beneath Ainz's careful authority, and the far more urgent matter of the Theocracy's interest. Link's expression darkened with each detail, his hand drifting unconsciously to the Master Sword's hilt. "So now we're caught between two powers who both want what we're carrying," he said. "One that's at least being honest about wanting to study it, and one that sounds like it'll just take it by force." "That's roughly the shape of it," Zelda agreed grimly. She moved to the window, looking out over the moonlit courtyard, the distant silhouettes of patrols still marching their endless, disciplined rounds. "But there's something else. Ainz isn't simply a conqueror hoarding power for its own sake. There's genuine curiosity there, maybe even something like loneliness, buried under all that careful calculation. I don't think that makes him safe, but it might make him something other than a simple enemy. Or it's exactly the kind of vulnerability a being that powerful would want us to see," Link said, "to make us trust him before he decides exactly how useful we really are." It was a fair point, and one Zelda couldn't entirely dismiss. She'd navigated enough courts, faced enough enemies wearing the mask of allies, to know that the line between genuine connection and calculated manipulation could be vanishingly thin, especially when the person doing the calculating was centuries old and vastly more experienced in the art than she was. "Then we watch," she said finally. "We stay cautious, but we don't close every door either. Right now, whatever Ainz's true motives, he's the only thing standing between us and a theocracy that apparently doesn't care whether we survive the taking." Following morning brought confirmation of exactly how quickly the situation had escalated. Albedo arrived at their quarters before dawn, her composed diplomatic demeanor replaced by something sharper, more urgent. "There has been a development," she said without preamble. "A theocracy scouting party was intercepted attempting to infiltrate the tomb's outer perimeter overnight. They were dealt with, but their presence confirms Ainz Sama's concerns. The theocracy knows precisely where you are and precisely what you carry." Her golden eyes flicked between them, calculating. "Ainz Sama requests your presence, immediately." They found him not in the throne room this time, but in a chamber Zelda hadn't yet seen, a vast circular room dominated by an enormous crystalline sphere suspended at its center, pulsing with slow, ominous light. Several of the floor guardians were already present, arranged around the chamber's perimeter with the tense readiness of soldiers awaiting orders. "The situation has accelerated faster than I anticipated," Ainz said without preamble, his crimson eyes fixed on Zelda with an intensity that carried none of the careful academic curiosity from their conversation the night before. "The Slane Theocracy has dispatched what my intelligence suggests is a significant military force, moving under the guise of a religious pilgrimage toward Nazarick's borders. Their stated purpose is diplomatic. Their true intent, given their historical conduct toward anything they classify as a false miracle, is considerably less benign. "They're coming for the Triforce," Zelda said, the words settling in her stomach like a stone. "They are coming for you," Ainz corrected, "which, given the nature of the artifact you carry, amounts to the same threat by a different name." The Theocracy's doctrine holds that any manifestation of divine power outside their own sanctioned church is heresy to be eliminated, or more likely, given the value involved, seized and reclassified as a true miracle under their authority. He paused, and something in his stillness carried a weight that felt, for the first time since their arrival, genuinely dangerous, not toward her, she understood, but toward whatever force dared approach what he now clearly considered in some fashion his to protect. "I do not take kindly to trespass upon what I have claimed as guest right, Princess, nor do I take kindly to being tested." Link stepped forward, jaw set. "What do you need from us?" Ainz's gaze shifted to him, something almost approving in the crimson depths. "Patience, hero, and trust, however difficult either may prove given the circumstances. Nazarick's defenses are more than sufficient to repel a force of this scale without difficulty. What I require is time, and the assurance that neither of you will do something reckless in the interim that complicates an already delicate situation." He turned back to the crystalline sphere, its light pulsing brighter as though responding to his attention. "The Theocracy will reach our borders within 3 days. I intend for them to find those borders considerably more hostile than they anticipate." Zelda felt the Triforce mark on her hand pulse hard, almost painfully, in response to the tension building in the room, as though some deep instinct within the relic itself recognized the gathering storm for what it was. She thought of Hyrule, of the countless calamities she and Link had faced together, and understood with sudden cold clarity that whatever conflict was coming would test not just Nazarick's formidable defenses, but the fragile, uncertain alliance she and Link had begun building with a being neither of them fully trusted, in a world that offered no guarantee of mercy to anyone who showed weakness. "Then we'll be ready," she said, meeting Ainz's crimson gaze directly. "Whatever comes." Something in his posture shifted, approval, perhaps, or simple satisfaction at an answer he'd hoped for. "Good," he said, "because I suspect, Princess, that the coming days will reveal a great deal about precisely what kind of power you and your hero truly carry, and precisely how far this world's greatest powers are willing to go to claim it for themselves." Outside, beyond Nazarick's black walls, the first banners of the Slane Theocracy's approaching column were already visible on the horizon, catching the dawn light like a blade drawn in anticipation of a war neither side had yet officially declared. The 3 days before the Theocracy's arrival passed in a blur of preparation unlike anything Zelda had witnessed even during Hyrule's darkest hours before Calamity Ganon's fall. Nazarick did not simply arm itself, it transformed, every floor humming with an efficiency that felt less like panic, and more like a machine settling into a well-rehearsed function it had performed 100 times before. She and Link were given a vantage point atop one of the outer towers on the morning of the second day, ostensibly as an act of trust, though Zelda suspected it served Ainz's purposes just as much as theirs, a chance to demonstrate without a single word of boasting exactly what kind of power they had allied themselves with. Below them, the courtyard swarmed with troop movements of staggering scale, ranks of skeletal soldiers marching in perfect unison, war constructs the size of small houses lumbering into defensive positions, and above it all, winged shapes wheeling through the gray morning sky in patterns too disciplined to be anything but coordinated patrol. "Seen armies," Link said quietly, watching the formations below with an expression Zelda hadn't seen on him since the worst days of the calamity. "I've never seen anything organized like this. That's what worries me," Zelda replied. "An army fights because it has to. This looks like something that fights because it's simply what it was built to do." It was on the second evening that Shaltir Bloodfallen sought them out again, this time without the predatory circling of their first meeting, though her interest remained undimmed. She found them in the Tower Gardens, where Zelda had taken to walking in the evenings, partly for the fresh air and partly for the chance to think without Nazarick's ever-present attendance hovering at the edge of every conversation. Troubled, Shaltir observed, dropping into step beside Zelda with unnerving silence for someone of her considerable frame. "Understandable. Most mortals find the prospect of standing beside true monsters rather than against them a difficult adjustment." "I'm not troubled by standing beside you," Zelda said carefully. I'm troubled by what it might cost the people caught in between. The Theocracy's soldiers, the villages along their approach, how many of them even understand what they're marching toward? Something flickered across Shaltyr's expression, an emotion Zelda couldn't quite place, not quite surprise, not quite respect, but adjacent to both. You worry for enemy soldiers, she said, as though testing the concept for flaws. Interesting. Most who ally themselves with Nazarick learn quickly to set such concerns aside. Ainz-sama's enemies are not spared for sentiment. That's precisely what worries me, Zelda said. I've fought calamities that wanted to end the world. I understand fighting against annihilation. What I don't understand yet is what Nazarick fights for beyond simply expanding what it already controls. Shaltyr was quiet for a long moment, her crimson eyes fixed on the darkening horizon where somewhere beyond sight, the Theocracy's column continued its steady advance. Ainz-sama built order from chaos, she said finally, and for once the words carried less rehearsed doctrine and more something that sounded almost like genuine conviction. Before the Sorcerer Kingdom, this region was ruled by petty nobles who starved their own people while feasting in gilded halls. Bandits who preyed on merchants and farmers alike, secure in the knowledge that no one powerful enough cared to stop them. Ainz-sama cared. Whatever else you believe of him, believe that the order he has built, however severe its methods, has saved more lives than it has claimed. It was, Zelda thought, both a genuine defense and a carefully incomplete one, the kind of loyalty that saw the good clearly while choosing not to dwell too long on the costs. She'd have believed it more fully if she hadn't seen the husks in the forest on their first day, or heard Narbrel's careful, clipped justifications for necessary severity. The truth, she suspected, lay somewhere in the considerable distance between Shaltyr's genuine devotion and her own wary skepticism, a truth she still didn't have enough information to fully judge. Link, for his part, had spent the 2 days of preparation differently, not in quiet conversation, but in the training yards where he'd found, somewhat to Zelda's surprise, that his skill with the blade earned him a grudging respect even among Nazarick's considerable martial ranks. He sparred against a captain of the Death Knight Legion on the second afternoon, a bout that drew a small crowd of curious onlookers, and though he lost, decisively, the knight's supernatural strength eventually overwhelming his guard, the manner of his losing, refusing to yield until the very last exchange, seemed to shift something in how the garrison regarded him. You fight like someone who's lost before and kept fighting anyway, the Death Knight's captain observed afterward, offering Link a hand to help him up from where he'd been driven to one knee, a courtesy Zelda hadn't expected from a being of such casual, terrible strength. I have, Link said simply, accepting the hand. More than once, it's how you learn what's actually worth protecting. It was a small exchange, but it mattered, another thread in the fragile, uncertain trust being woven between two travelers with nothing but a legendary blade and a princess's diplomatic instincts, and a fortress of monsters that had spent centuries needing neither trust nor diplomacy to survive. The Theocracy's column arrived at dawn on the third day, exactly as Ainz had predicted. Their banners, a stylized sun wreathed in laurel, visible across the cleared ground before Nazarick's outer walls long before the soldiers themselves came into clear view. Zelda watched from the same tower vantage as the force arrayed itself in formation. Several thousand strong, their front ranks bearing the distinctive armor of paladins, behind them ranks of battle clerics whose formations pulsed faintly with the telltale glow of prepared divine magic, and at the column's rear, a smaller, more ornately armored group that radiated an entirely different, colder kind of authority. Cardinals, Albedo said, appearing at Zelda's shoulder with the silent precision that seemed to characterize every one of Nazarick's inhabitants. The Theocracy's ruling council does not typically risk itself on the field. Their presence here confirms the significance they place on retrieving you, Princess. They're not here for a negotiation, Zelda said, watching the formations settle into position with grim, practiced efficiency. No, Albedo agreed. Though they will likely offer one regardless, if only to establish the moral pretext for what follows. The Theocracy is fond of appearing righteous even in the pursuit of conquest. Negotiation, when it came, was brief and exactly as futile as Albedo had predicted. A single envoy rode forward under a banner of parley, delivering a demand, relayed to Zelda secondhand through one of Ainz's scrying constructs, that the foreign artifact of divine origin and its bearer be surrendered to the Theocracy's custody, in exchange for which the Sorcerer Kingdom's borders would be spared the purifying attention the Theocracy's forces were prepared to bring to bear. Ainz's response, delivered through albedo with the same measured calm he'd shown throughout every conversation Zelda had witnessed, was a single sentence. Nazarick does not negotiate the surrender of its guests. Battle that followed was unlike anything Zelda had witnessed in all her years defending Hyrule. It began with the Theocracy's battle clerics unleashing a coordinated barrage of holy magic against Nazarick's outer defenses, brilliant lances of golden light that should, by every principle of warfare Zelda understood, have devastated whatever they struck. Instead, the light broke against Nazarick's defensive wards like waves against an unmoved cliff face, the fortress's ancient magic absorbing and dispersing the assault with an ease that bordered on contemptuous. What followed was not a battle so much as a demonstration. Nazarick's forces moved with the same eerie, disciplined precision Zelda had observed in every aspect of the tomb's operation, engaging the Theocracy's paladins and clerics not with overwhelming force from the outset, but with a calculated, almost surgical escalation, probing first with lesser constructs and skeletal legions, gauging the Theocracy's true capabilities, before the floor guardians themselves entered the field. Shaltyr's arrival on the battlefield was, Zelda thought, something closer to a natural disaster than a military engagement. She moved through the Theocracy's front ranks like a scythe through wheat, her supernatural speed rendering the paladins' formations meaningless, their divine wards shattering against attacks that seemed to bypass conventional defense entirely. Zelda watched from the tower with a mixture of horror and grim understanding. This was not cruelty for its own sake, whatever her instincts screamed. This was a demonstration calculated precisely to end the engagement as quickly, and with as few Nazarick casualties as possible. It was Link who first noticed the shift in the battle's rhythm, a sudden reorganization among the Theocracy's rear ranks, the ornately armored cardinals raising their hands in unison, weaving together a working of magic that felt, even from the tower's considerable distance, fundamentally different from the divine offense they'd unleashed thus far. "That's not an attack," Link said, his eyes narrowing. "That's a summoning." He was right. The air above the battlefield split open with a sound like tearing silk, and from the rift emerged something that made even Nazarick's disciplined ranks pause in their advance, an enormous radiant figure, vaguely humanoid but clearly not mortal, its form composed of shifting golden light and geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. A divine avatar summoned at terrible cost, clearly intended as the Theocracy's final answer to Nazarick's overwhelming defense. Ainz himself entered the field at that moment, his arrival marked not by dramatic fanfare but by a simple, absolute stillness that seemed to settle over the battlefield the instant his robed figure appeared. The fighting around him slowed, almost involuntarily, as though every combatant present understood on some primal level that something far beyond their own capability had just entered the equation. "An avatar," Ainz observed, his voice carrying clearly across the battlefield despite its apparent calm. "Costly, foolish given the alternative outcomes available to your council, but undeniably a statement of how badly the Theocracy wants what stands behind me." Confrontation that followed defied every framework Zelda had for understanding combat. Ainz did not charge, did not posture, did not waste a single unnecessary motion. He simply raised one skeletal hand, spoke a word in a language that seemed to bend the air itself, and the golden avatar, a being summoned at the cost of considerable divine favor, meant to embody the Theocracy's ultimate answer to any threat, simply ceased, not destroyed in any conventional sense Zelda could parse. Erased as though the magic sustaining its existence had been unwritten from reality itself, the silence that followed was absolute. Even the Theocracy's remaining forces, battered but not yet broken, seemed to understand in that instant precisely what they had been arrayed against. "Withdraw," Ainz said, and his voice, though quiet, carried to every corner of the field with unmistakable finality. "Return to your Theocracy. Inform your council that Nazarick's guests are not theirs to claim now or ever. And inform them further that should this lesson require repeating, I will not extend the courtesy of a battlefield next time." Theocracy's remaining forces withdrew in a retreat that bordered on rout, their formation discipline finally cracking under the weight of what they'd just witnessed. Zelda watched from the tower as the golden banners retreated across the cleared ground, the battlefield left littered with the debris of a conflict that had lasted in total barely 2 hours. It was that night in the aftermath that Zelda finally understood the true weight of what she and Link had allied themselves with, not merely a powerful kingdom, but something closer to an unstoppable force of nature wearing the shape of careful diplomacy. She found Ainz alone in the same chamber where they'd first spoken candidly, the crystalline sphere at its center now dimmed to a low, steady pulse. "You could have ended that battle in seconds," she said without preamble. "Why let it unfold as it did? Why risk your guardians at all when you clearly held that kind of power in reserve?" Ainz was quiet for a long moment, his crimson eyes fixed on the dimmed sphere. "Because a lesson delivered too quickly is a lesson forgot too easily," he said finally. "The Theocracy needed to see my guardian's strength tested and proven, not simply my own overwhelming power demonstrated in isolation. Fear of Nazarick as an institution serves my purposes considerably better than fear of myself alone." A pause. "Though I confess, there is also a simpler truth beneath the strategy. My guardians take genuine pride in their strength being tested and proven. I find myself reluctant more often than I once was to deny them that purpose." It was, Zelda thought, another small crack in the careful armor of calculated authority, a genuine fondness buried deep, for the strange and terrible family he had built around himself across however many centuries of solitary rule. She thought of Link's words from days before, that such vulnerability might be exactly the kind of thing a being this powerful would want her to see, to earn a trust he could later exploit, and found to her own quiet unease that she wasn't certain any longer whether that caution still fully applied. "Theocracy will return," she said instead. "With more than an avatar next time." "Undoubtedly," Ainz agreed. "Though I suspect, Princess, that the greater danger is not the Theocracy at all. A power capable of opening a rift between worlds, capable of drawing you and your hero across a boundary I did not know existed until your arrival, is not a power the Theocracy possesses, whatever their aspirations. Something else caused your displacement, something with considerably greater reach than a mortal kingdom's ambition." His crimson eyes fixed on her with renewed, unsettling focus. "And I suspect, given the timing of your arrival and the Theocracy's sudden, uncharacteristically reckless aggression, that whatever drew you here has not finished with either of our worlds yet." Outside, beyond the tower's window, the last fires of the battlefield were finally dying into embers, and somewhere far above the clouds, in a place no mortal eye within either world could yet perceive, something ancient and patient continued watching the pieces it had set into motion, waiting for the moment when hero, princess, and sorcerer king alike would finally understand the true scale of the storm gathering around them. The days that followed the Theocracy's retreat carried a strange, uneasy quality, not quite peace, but not the sharp tension of open war either. Nazarick's forces stood down from their highest alert, though the patrols never fully relaxed, and Zelda noticed that the scrying devices scattered throughout the fortress's upper floors seemed to work with renewed urgency. Ainz's attention clearly turned toward the larger mystery of what had drawn her, and Link across the boundary between worlds in the first place. It was during this uneasy interlude that the fracture began, not through malice, not through any grand betrayal, but through the slow accumulation of small pressures that Zelda would later recognize, with the clarity of hindsight, as the inevitable consequence of two fundamentally different worldviews sharing the same narrow space for too long. It started with Cocytus. The guardian of the fifth floor sought out Link on the fourth morning after the battle, finding him in the training yards where he'd taken to running drills alone in the pale dawnlight, a habit Zelda recognized from their years together in Hyrule, the way Link processed uncertainty and grief through the familiar discipline of the blade. Cocytus was a being of imposing, insected majesty, his voice carrying the formal cadence of a warrior who valued honor above almost every other consideration. "Hero," Cocytus said, his mandibles clicking in what Zelda later learned was a gesture of respect among his kind. "I have observed your training. Your technique carries the mark of genuine discipline honed against threats worthy of the name. I would test that discipline properly if you are willing." Link, ever hungry for a fight that might teach him something about the true scope of his own limitations in this world, agreed without hesitation. What followed, according to the small crowd of onlookers who gathered to witness it, was a duel unlike any Nazarick's training yards had seen in some time, Cocytus fighting not with the casual, contemptuous ease Shaltir had shown against the Theocracy's paladins, but with genuine, focused intensity, clearly recognizing in Link something that merited his full and considerable attention. Link lost decisively, and by a wider margin than his previous bout against the Death Knight captain, driven to his knees by a combination of Cocytus's overwhelming physical superiority and a mastery of martial technique refined across centuries of existence no mortal lifetime could match. But it was what happened after the duel's conclusion that mattered, Cocytus offering not contempt for the loss, but a formal, considered assessment of Link's technique, along with an unprecedented offer to continue training him personally in the weeks ahead, that his evident potential might be properly honed toward its true capacity. It should have been by any reasonable measure a positive development, a bridge being built between two travelers and the terrifying power they'd allied themselves with. Instead, it became the spark for the first real fracture in the fragile trust Zelda had spent days carefully cultivating, She found Link that evening in a state she hadn't seen since the darkest days before Calamity Ganon's defeat. Not defeated exactly, but troubled in a way that ran deeper than a simple loss on the training field. "He offered to train me," Link said without preamble when she found him on the tower balcony overlooking the fortress's outer walls. "Cocytus said I had evident potential," he said the words with a strange, bitter weight. "Do you know what that means, Zelda? It means he looked at everything I've done, everything I've survived, every calamity I've faced down with nothing but steel and stubbornness, and saw a child still learning to hold a sword properly." "That's not what he meant," Zelda said carefully, though she understood even as she said it that the truth of Cocytus's intention mattered considerably less than how the offer had landed against Link's own sense of himself. "He respects you." Respect in a world like this often comes wrapped in exactly that kind of blunt honesty. "I know what respect looks like," Link said, sharper than she'd expected. "This isn't that. Every day we spend here, I watch you drawn deeper into conversations with Ainz that leave you looking at him like there's something worth understanding there, beneath everything he's built out of bones and conquest. And every day I get shown again and again exactly how small my sword looks against what this world actually contains." He turned to face her fully, and Zelda saw beneath the frustration something rawer and more painful. "I'm supposed to be your protector. That's who I am in Hyrule. Here, I can't even beat a guardian in a training bout without getting reminded I'm barely worth their notice." Zelda felt the weight of his words settle over her with uncomfortable clarity, not because he was wrong to feel what he felt, but because she recognized with sudden guilt how thoroughly she'd been absorbed in her own careful diplomatic dance with Ainz, how little space she'd left in her attention for the quieter crisis unfolding in the person who'd stood beside her through every calamity Hyrule had ever thrown at them both. "Not small," she said, moving to stand beside him at the balcony's edge. "Link, everything that makes you who you are, the courage the Master Sword recognized, the will that's carried you through fights the goddesses themselves couldn't win alone, that hasn't diminished because we've landed somewhere that measures strength differently. I need you exactly as much here as I ever have in Hyrule. Maybe more, because here I don't fully trust my own judgment about who's genuinely worth trusting. It should have been enough. In another circumstance, perhaps it would have been." But the words landed against a wound that had been quietly deepening for days, and Link's expression didn't fully soften, even as he nodded and let the conversation settle into an uneasy, incomplete peace. The true fracture came 2 days later, and it came, as Zelda would later recognize, from precisely the direction neither of them had been watching closely enough. It began with a message, delivered not through Nazarick's usual channels, but through a small, weathered courier bird that somehow found its way past the fortress's considerable magical defenses to land upon the tower balcony where Link had taken to spending his mornings. The message, written in a careful, formal hand, bore no signature, but its contents were unmistakable in their implication. A warning, purportedly from a faction within the Theocracy sympathetic to the traveler's plight, claiming that Ainz Ooal's interest in the Triforce ran considerably deeper and darker than diplomatic curiosity, that his true intention, once sufficient understanding of the relic's nature had been extracted, was to claim it outright, by whatever means necessary. Adding its power to Nazarick's already formidable arsenal, Link brought the message to Zelda with barely restrained urgency. "This could be exactly the kind of misdirection you'd expect from a desperate enemy," he admitted, "but it could also be exactly the truth we haven't wanted to see. Zelda, think about it. Every conversation, every kindness, every moment of vulnerability he's shown you, what if it's all been building toward exactly this?" Zelda studied the message carefully, her diplomatic instincts warring with the cold logic of the accusation. It was, she had to admit, precisely the kind of manipulation the Theocracy might attempt, sowing doubt between allies as effectively as any battlefield victory. But it was also, uncomfortably, not entirely inconsistent with things Ainz himself had said, the barely concealed eagerness that colored every conversation touching on the Triforce's true nature and origin. "We ask him directly," she said finally. "Whatever the message's true source, the only way to know its truth is to bring it into the light rather than let it fester in silence." They found Ainz in the chamber with the crystalline sphere, as had become his habit during the long hours he spent parsing the mystery of their displacement. He listened to Zelda's account of the message with his characteristic stillness, crimson eyes betraying nothing of whatever calculation moved behind them. "A predictable strategy," he said when she'd finished. "Sow distrust where trust has begun to form, weaken an alliance through doubt rather than force, since force has already proven insufficient." He paused. I will not insult either of you by claiming the accusation is entirely without foundation, however. I am, and have always been genuinely interested in understanding the full nature and potential of the Triforce. I would be lying to claim that interest carries no ambition alongside its curiosity. Admission, delivered with such careful honesty, should perhaps have reassured them. Instead, it landed like confirmation of exactly the fear the message had planted. So you don't deny wanting it, Link said, his hand drifting to the Master Sword's hilt, an old habit surfacing under new pressure. I do not deny wanting to understand it fully, Ainz corrected, his tone carrying the first genuine edge of frustration Zelda had heard from him. There is a considerable difference, hero, between curiosity and theft, though I understand why being raised in a world of simpler moral categories might struggle to distinguish the two under pressure. Don't, Zelda said sharply, stepping between them before the exchange could escalate further. Both of you, this is precisely what the message was designed to accomplish, turning genuine uncertainty into open conflict before either side has had the chance to actually address it honestly. But the damage, however small, had already been done. Link's trust, already fraying under the accumulated weight of days, spent feeling diminished in a world that measured his worth in terms he'd never had to defend before, had found a foothold for the doubt it had been quietly nursing. And Ainz, for his part, seemed to withdraw slightly, the careful vulnerability of their earlier conversations replaced by a more guarded, formal distance. It was 3 days later that the true crisis arrived, and it arrived from a direction none of them had fully anticipated. The scrying constructs that monitored Nazarick's borders detected the anomaly first, a tear in the fabric of reality, similar in signature to the rift that had brought Zelda and Link into the new world, but larger and radiating an energy that Ainz's most sophisticated divination magic struggled to fully categorize. It opened not at the fortress's borders but directly above the great forest's heart, close enough to Nazarick that the entire garrison mobilized within minutes of the first alert. What emerged from the rift was not another army, not another faction seeking to claim the Triforce for its own purposes. It was something far older and far more patient, a being of shifting indistinct form that seemed to exist at the edges of perception, its presence causing even Nazarick's most powerful guardians to hesitate, uncertain of exactly what they faced. It is not native to this world, Ainz said, his voice carrying an unfamiliar note of genuine alarm as he studied the reports flooding in from his scouts. Nor, I suspect, to yours, Princess. Signature carries elements of both, as though it exists in the space between worlds, drawn here by something that opened and has not yet closed the boundary between them. Zelda felt the Triforce mark on her hand burn with sudden, painful intensity, and understood with cold, dawning horror exactly what she was looking at. The rift that brought us here, she said. It never fully closed. Something's been using it, feeding on it maybe, growing stronger with every day it's remained open. Being which Ainz's scholars would later, in the frantic hours that followed, begin referring to simply as the Riftwalker, for lack of any more precise designation, did not attack immediately. Instead, it seemed to study the assembled forces of Nazarick with an unhurried, almost curious patience, its indistinct form occasionally coalescing into something closer to a recognizable shape before dissolving again into shifting shadow and light. It was Link who first understood the nature of the threat they truly faced. It's not here for Nazarick, he said, watching the being's slow, deliberate movement toward the forest's edge, toward where the original rift had first opened during their arrival. It's here for the tier itself, for the doorway. What end? Albedo asked, her composed diplomacy giving way to something sharper, more urgent, as she coordinated the Guardian's defensive positioning around the anomaly. To keep it open, Zelda said, understanding crystallizing with sudden, terrible clarity. Every day it stays open, more of whatever that thing is bleeds through, and the longer it remains, the more it feeds on the boundary itself, on the energy of both our worlds colliding. She looked to Ainz, urgency overriding the careful distance that had grown between them over the preceding days. This is what drew us here in the first place, not chance, not simple accident. Something opened that rift deliberately, and whatever it was, it's still here, still working toward whatever purpose brought us across in the first place. Ainz's crimson eyes fixed on the distant, shifting form with an intensity that carried none of his usual measured calm. Then we face not merely a threat to Nazarick or to the new world, he said slowly, but potentially to the stability of the boundary between our two worlds entirely. Should that rift remain open long enough, should this Riftwalker succeed in whatever purpose drives it, the consequences may extend considerably beyond a single kingdom's borders. Battle that followed was unlike anything that had come before, not the disciplined, almost surgical demonstration of force Nazarick had shown against the Theocracy, but something far more chaotic, far more uncertain, as guardian and hero alike struggled against an enemy whose true nature defied every framework either world possessed for understanding combat. Shaltyr's supernatural speed found no purchase against a being that seemed to exist partially outside conventional space. Cocytus's mastery of martial technique proved similarly ineffective against an opponent whose form shifted and dissolved faster than any blow could land true damage. It was Ainz who finally forced a genuine engagement, unleashing magic of a scale and complexity Zelda had not yet witnessed even in the aftermath of the Theocracy's failed avatar summoning spells that seemed to bend the very geometry of the battlefield, attempting to pin the Riftwalker's shifting form into something solid enough to properly strike. For a moment it seemed to be working, the being's indistinct edges solidifying under the pressure of Ainz's overwhelming magical assault. And then, with a suddenness that caught even Nazarick's disciplined forces off guard, the Riftwalker turned its full, undivided attention toward Zelda. She felt it before she consciously understood what was happening, a pull, deep and instinctive, radiating from the Triforce mark on her hand, as though the relic itself recognized something in the being's nature that resonated with its own ancient, divine origin. The Riftwalker's shifting form surged toward her with sudden, terrifying speed, and for one suspended moment, Zelda understood with absolute clarity that whatever this being truly was, it had not come merely to keep a doorway open. It had come specifically for what she carried. Link moved before conscious thought could catch up to instinct, throwing himself between Zelda and the incoming threat with the same unhesitating courage that had carried him through every calamity Hyrule had ever demanded of him. The Master Sword met the Riftwalker's shifting form in a collision that sent a shockwave rippling across the battlefield, blade and being locked in a struggle that defied easy description, light against shadow, ancient steel forged to strike down evil against a force that seemed to exist in the spaces between good and evil entirely. For a moment, it seemed the Master Sword's legendary power might be enough. The blade's light cut into the Riftwalker's form with visible effect, the being's shifting edges fraying under the sword's ancient, purifying strength. But the effort came at a cost Zelda hadn't anticipated, Link straining under the weight of holding back a force that operated on principles neither Hyrule's magic nor the New Worlds had ever needed to account for, his own strength beginning visibly to falter. Link. Zelda's voice cut across the battlefield's chaos, and without conscious decision she felt the Triforce respond to her fear, to the desperate need to protect the person who had spent his entire existence protecting her. Golden light surged from the mark on her hand, wrapping around Link's blade, and for one blinding moment, the Master Sword blazed with a purity of light that seemed to rival the sun itself. The Riftwalker recoiled, its form fracturing under the combined assault of ancient steel and divine light, and with a final discordant shriek that seemed to echo from somewhere beyond conventional space entirely, it dissolved back into the tear from which it had emerged, the rift itself contracting violently in its wake. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the ragged sound of Link's breathing as he lowered the Master Sword, its blade returning slowly to its familiar, quieter gleam. Zelda reached him in seconds, checking him for injury with the same desperate urgency she'd felt during every crisis they'd weathered together across the years. "I'm fine," Link said, though his voice carried the exhaustion of having pushed himself far beyond his usual limits. "Zelda, that light, that was the Triforce, wasn't it? Not just power. Something closer to what it actually is underneath everything else." She looked down at her hand, where the golden mark still pulsed, warmer now, steadier, as though something in the confrontation had settled a question the relic itself had been quietly asking since their arrival. "I think," she said slowly, "that it just showed us exactly why that thing wanted it so badly, and exactly what we still don't understand about what we're truly protecting." Ainz approached as the last echoes of battle settled into an uneasy quiet across the ravaged forest clearing, his crimson eyes moving between the two travelers with an expression that, for the first time since their arrival, carried something unmistakably close to genuine respect. "Rift has not fully closed," he said, studying the fractured, still visible tear hovering above the clearing's center. "Weakened, certainly. But the Riftwalker's retreat suggests it was wounded, not destroyed, and where wounded it will seek to heal and likely return with whatever reinforcement its true nature can summon from beyond the boundary it seeks to exploit." He turned his full attention to Zelda, his tone carrying unusual gravity. "Princess, I believe the time for careful diplomacy and gradual understanding has passed. Whatever brought you and your hero to this world, whatever that being truly seeks, I suspect we are no longer facing a threat that respects the boundaries of kingdoms, factions, or careful negotiation. We face something that threatens the fundamental stability between our two worlds entirely." Zelda looked to Link, saw in his exhausted but resolute expression the same understanding settling over him that had settled over her, that whatever doubts had grown between them in recent days, whatever uncertainty still colored their fragile alliance with the Sorcerer King and his terrible, magnificent fortress, none of it mattered as much in this moment as the shared recognition of a threat that dwarfed every consideration that had come before it. "Then we stopped being cautious allies," she said, meeting Ainz's crimson gaze with the same resolve that had carried her through every calamity Hyrule had ever demanded she face. "And start being something closer to genuine ones. Whatever that thing is, whatever it wants, we're not going to survive facing it divided by doubt and half-trust." Something shifted in Ainz's posture, not quite relief, not quite triumph, but something adjacent to both. The careful mask of measured authority giving way, if only briefly, to something that felt almost like relief at no longer having to calculate every gesture of trust against the possibility of betrayal. "Then let us begin," he said. "By understanding precisely what we're truly facing, and precisely what price closing that rift permanently may yet demand of all of us." Behind them, the fractured tear in the sky continued its slow, ominous pulse, a wound between worlds that had not yet finished bleeding, and somewhere beyond its shifting boundary, something ancient and patient continued gathering its strength for whatever confrontation still awaited them all. The days following the Riftwalkers' retreat transformed Nazarick into something Zelda hadn't yet witnessed in her time within its walls, not the disciplined calm of a fortress at rest, nor the frantic mobilization of a fortress at war, but something closer to a war council operating at the edge of genuine uncertainty. For all its overwhelming power, Zelda came to understand, Nazarick had never faced a threat quite like this one. An enemy that didn't respect borders, armies, or the careful power structures the new world had organized itself around for centuries. Ainz convened his full council of floor guardians on the morning after the battle, and for the first time, Zelda and Link were invited to sit among them, not as guests observing from a careful distance, but as participants whose knowledge of the rift's origin might prove essential to understanding what they now faced. "Riftwalker is not a creature native to either of our worlds," Ainz said, addressing the assembled guardians with the same measured authority he brought to every pronouncement, though Zelda had learned by now to hear the genuine uncertainty threaded beneath it. "It exists, as best my scholars and I can determine, in the liminal space between realities, a space that should not, under any natural law either world operates by, permit sustained crossing. Its presence here suggests something opened that boundary deliberately, and has maintained it open long enough for such a being to take root." "Deliberately," Shalti repeated, her crimson eyes narrowing. "Then this was no accident. Someone or something orchestrated the princess and her hero's arrival." "That is my growing suspicion, yes," Ainz confirmed, though the identity and motive behind such an act remains, for now, beyond even Nazarick's considerable capacity to divine. It was Zelda who offered the thread that finally began pulling the mystery into focus, a detail she'd nearly dismissed in the chaos of their arrival, but which returned to her now with sudden, sharpened relevance. "Before we arrived," she said slowly, "the Triforce reacted, not to danger in Hyrule, to something beyond it, as though it sensed the rift opening before it ever touched us." She looked to her own hand, where the mark still pulsed with its familiar, steady warmth. "The goddess's gift isn't simply power. It's balance, courage, wisdom, and power in harmony, holding back forces that would unmake the world if left unchecked. If something sought to breach the boundary between worlds, the Triforce may have been drawn here specifically because it represents exactly the kind of balancing force capable of resisting that breach." Ainz was quiet for a long moment, processing the implication with visible care. "Then the Riftwalker's interest in you was never incidental," he said finally. "It sought to claim, or perhaps simply eliminate, the one force within either world capable of meaningfully opposing whatever purpose drives it." His crimson eyes fixed on her with renewed intensity. "Which suggests, Princess, that your continued presence here is not merely fortunate happenstance for Nazarick's sake. It may be the single greatest obstacle standing between whatever seeks to unmake the boundary between our worlds and its success in doing so." Weight of that realization settled over the council chamber with palpable gravity. Link, who had remained largely silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke, his voice carrying the quiet resolve Zelda had come to rely on through every crisis they'd faced together. "Then we close it," he said simply. "Permanently, whatever it takes." Simple solution to a considerably more complex problem, Ainz said, though something in his tone suggested genuine appreciation for the directness. "The rift cannot simply be willed shut, hero. It requires a working of considerable magical sophistication, one that draws on both the nature of the boundary itself and, I suspect, on the specific nature of whatever power first opened it. Nazarick possesses considerable magical resource, but the working required here may demand something beyond even our combined capability, absent a more complete understanding of the Triforce's own nature and its relationship to the rift." It was Demiurge, guardian of the seventh floor, who had remained largely silent throughout the council's proceedings, who finally offered the observation that would shape the days that followed. "If the princess's relic responded to the rift's opening before her arrival," he said, his voice carrying the careful, analytical precision Zelda had come to associate with him, "then it stands to reason that a working combining the Triforce's own power with Nazarick's magical resources may accomplish what neither could achieve alone. The relic recognizes the threat. Perhaps it need only be guided toward resolving it." Plan that emerged from the following days of careful preparation was, by any measure, an unprecedented undertaking, a working that would draw simultaneously on Nazarick's most sophisticated ritual magic and the Triforce's own ancient, divine nature, attempting to not merely close the fractured rift but seal it in a manner that would prevent any future breach at the same location. It required, Ainz explained with characteristic bluntness, a level of trust and cooperation between Zelda and Nazarick's magical apparatus that neither side had fully extended to the other until this point, an intimacy of shared purpose that left Zelda feeling, for the first time since her arrival, genuinely vulnerable in ways that had nothing to do with physical danger. It was during these preparations that the fracture between Link and Ainz finally found its resolution, not through grand reconciliation, but through the quiet accumulated weight of shared purpose in the face of a threat that dwarfed whatever doubts had grown between them. Link found Ainz alone in the chamber housing the crystalline sphere on the evening before the working was to be attempted, the Sorcerer King reviewing scrolls of ritual preparation with the same tireless focus he brought to every undertaking. "Owe you something," Link said without preamble when Ainz acknowledged his presence. Not an apology exactly, but an acknowledgement. "The message that came before the Riftwalker's attack, I let it plant doubt. I should have questioned harder before I let it shape how I treated you." Ainz set down the scroll he'd been reviewing, his crimson eyes studying Link with something that might have been consideration. "Doubt is not without reason, hero, in a world such as this one. I have given you little enough cause in our brief acquaintance to extend trust freely. Centuries of rule have taught me that trust offered too easily is trust exploited too readily by those who do not deserve it." He paused. "That said, I recognize, in the manner you placed yourself between the princess and a threat neither of us fully understood. Something that speaks considerably louder than whatever doubt a forged message might have planted. Courage of that nature is not easily feigned nor easily dismissed. Cocytus offered to train me," Link said, the admission carrying less bitterness now than it had days before. "I took it as an insult. I don't think it was meant as one," Ainz agreed. "Cocytus does not offer his personal instruction lightly, nor to those he considers beneath genuine notice. If anything, hero, you should understand the offer as precisely the opposite of what you initially took it to be." A pause, and something in his stillness carried what Zelda, watching from the chamber's entrance, recognized as genuine warmth beneath the careful, measured authority. "Strength in this world is rarely static. What you demonstrated against the Riftwalker suggests considerable room yet to grow, not because what you already possess is insufficient, but because true strength, wherever it originates, is rarely finished growing." It was, Zelda thought, watching the exchange unfold, as close to genuine reconciliation as either of them was likely to offer directly, and it was enough. The tension that had colored the days following the forged message's arrival finally began to ease, replaced by something closer to the fragile, hard-won trust that had first begun forming in the earliest days of their alliance. The working itself took place 3 days later, at the Fractured Rift's location deep within the Great Forest, under conditions of preparation so exacting that Zelda found herself questioning, more than once, whether they had accounted for every variable that might determine success or catastrophic failure. Nazarick's full magical apparatus had been marshaled for the occasion, ranks of spellcasters arranged in precise formation, ritual circles inscribed across the clearing's ravaged ground with a complexity that spoke of centuries of accumulated magical knowledge, and at the working center, Ainz himself, prepared to channel the combined magical output of his considerable domain toward a single, unprecedented purpose. Zelda took her position at the ritual circle's heart, the Triforce mark on her hand already pulsing with an intensity that seemed to anticipate what was about to be demanded of it. Link stood beside her, the Master Sword drawn and ready, prepared to defend the working against whatever resistance the Riftwalker or whatever force truly stood behind it might muster in response. "Whenever you're ready, Princess," Ainz said, his voice carrying across the clearing with the same measured calm that had accompanied every crisis they'd weathered together thus far, though Zelda could hear, beneath it, genuine uncertainty about whether the working they were about to attempt would truly succeed. She closed her eyes, reaching not for the Triforce as a tool to be wielded, but as she'd learned across years of carrying its weight, as a partner to be trusted. Courage, wisdom, and power in balance, extended not in conquest but in protection. The mark on her hand blazed to sudden, brilliant life, gold light spilling outward to meet the ritual circle's own gathering power. And for a moment, the entire clearing seemed to hold its breath as two fundamentally different systems of magic, one ancient and divine, one meticulously constructed through centuries of careful study, reached toward each other across a gap that had never before been bridged. The rift responded first with violent resistance, its fractured edges flaring with the same shifting, indistinct energy that had characterized the Riftwalker's own form, as though the being that had fled days before had left some essence of itself bound to the tier's structure, fighting now to keep the boundary open against the combined effort to seal it. Zelda felt the resistance as a physical pressure, pushing back against the Triforce's light with an intensity that made her knees buckle, only Link's steadying hand at her shoulder keeping her upright through the working's most critical moment. "Hold," Ainz's voice cut through the chaos, carrying an authority that seemed to steady the entire ritual circle's gathered power. "The resistance is strongest at the moment of closure, precisely because it recognizes this may be its final opportunity to prevent what we intend." Zelda gathered every ounce of will she possessed, thinking not of the danger, not of the uncertainty that had colored so much of their time in this strange, magnificent, terrible world, but of Hyrule, of the goddesses who had entrusted her with this power not for conquest or glory, but for the simple, essential purpose of protecting what mattered against forces that would unmake it given the chance. The Triforce responded to that clarity of purpose with a surge of light that outshone everything that had come before it, gold radiance spilling across the clearing in a wave that seemed to wash away the Riftwalker's lingering resistance entirely. The rift closed with a sound like a held breath finally released, not violent, not catastrophic, but simply absolutely final, the fractured tier in reality sealing itself with a finality that Zelda felt resonate through the Triforce mark on her hand as a settling, satisfied warmth, as though the relic itself recognized a threat successfully neutralized. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the scattered sound of Nazarick's spellcasters lowering their ritual formations, the clearing's ravaged ground finally, fully still for the first time since the crisis had begun. "It's closed," Link said, his voice carrying quiet disbelief. "Zelda, it's actually closed." She opened her eyes, exhaustion settling over her in a wave now that the working's demands had finally released their grip, and found Ainz already moving toward her, his crimson eyes studying the sealed rift's location with the same careful scrutiny he brought to every significant undertaking. "A successful working," he said, and though his voice carried its usual measured calm, Zelda thought she detected, beneath it, genuine relief. "Though I confess, Princess, I did not fully anticipate the scale of resistance the closure would provoke. Whatever force first opened that boundary invested considerable effort in maintaining it. Its failure here represents no small setback to whatever purpose drove it. Not necessarily an ending," Zelda said, understanding settling over her even through her exhaustion. "Whatever opened that rift is still out there. It simply lost this particular attempt." "Undoubtedly," Ainz agreed. Though I suspect, given the resources required to open even a single such breach, considerable time will pass before another attempt becomes feasible. Time, Princess, that affords both our worlds the opportunity to prepare more thoroughly for whatever confrontation may yet come. It was in the days that followed the rift's closure that Zelda and Link finally began to seriously confront the question that had lingered beneath every crisis, every alliance, every hard-won moment of trust since their arrival. What came next? The rift that had brought them to the new world was sealed, but whether that meant a permanent separation from Hyrule, or simply the end of one particular pathway between worlds, remained, even after days of careful study by Nazarick's most sophisticated scholars, frustratingly uncertain. There may be other pathways, Ainz said during one of the careful, searching conversations that had become a nightly ritual in the chamber housing the crystalline sphere. The boundary between worlds, once proven permeable in one location, is rarely absolutely impermeable elsewhere. But locating such a pathway and doing so without inviting whatever force sought to exploit the one we've just sealed will require considerable time and careful study. Then we have a choice to make, Zelda said, looking to Link, who had grown increasingly thoughtful in the days since the rift's closure. Stay and help Nazarick understand what we're truly facing in the hope of eventually finding our way home, or continue searching immediately whatever the risk. It was Link who answered first, his expression carrying a certainty that surprised her, given the doubt that had colored so much of his experience within Nazarick's walls in the days before the Riftwalker's attack. "We stay," he said, "not because we don't want to go home, but because whatever's out there, whatever opened that rift in the first place, I don't think it's finished. And I'd rather face it standing beside people who have already proven they'll fight for us than run home and leave this world to face it alone." Zelda felt something settle in her chest at his words, not merely agreement, but a quiet, hard-won understanding that the fractures of recent days had, if anything, strengthened rather than weakened the foundation of trust they'd built together in this world and in Hyrule alike. "Agreed," she said, turning to Ainz. "We stay, for now. Until we better understand what we're truly protecting against, and until we've done what we can to ensure this world isn't left vulnerable to whatever comes next because we chose to leave too soon." Something shifted in Ainz's posture at her words, not quite surprise, but something adjacent to it, the careful, measured authority he wore like armor giving way, if only briefly, to something that felt genuinely, unmistakably moved. "Then Nazarick extends to both of you," he said, "not merely guest status but genuine alliance. Whatever threat yet gathers beyond the boundary we've sealed, you will face it with the full resource of the Sorcerer Kingdom standing beside you for as long as that alliance serves us both." In the weeks that followed, word of the alliance between the Sorcerer Kingdom and the mysterious travelers from beyond the boundary of known worlds spread throughout the New World's kingdoms and factions, reshaping the delicate balance of power that had defined the region since Nazarick's rise. The Slane Theocracy, chastened by their failed attempt to claim the Triforce by force, retreated into a wary, watchful peace, unwilling to risk further confrontation with a Sorcerer King who had demonstrated, beyond any reasonable doubt, both the will and the capability to defend what he now considered under his protection. Link, true to Cossidus's earlier offer, began training regularly with the Guardian of the Fifth Floor, his technique sharpening under instruction that pushed him toward capabilities he'd never had cause to develop in Hyrule's more conventional battles. The doubt that had colored his early days within Nazarick's walls gave way, gradually, to something closer to genuine respect, not merely for the raw power Nazarick's inhabitants commanded, but for the complex, often surprising humanity buried beneath monstrous exteriors and centuries of accumulated strength. Zelda, for her part, found herself drawn increasingly into Nazarick's scholarly pursuits, her own understanding of the Triforce's true nature deepening through conversations with Ainz that ranged far beyond simple diplomatic necessity into something closer to genuine intellectual partnership. She did not fully trust him, perhaps never fully would, given the vast gulf of experience and nature that separated a princess of Hyrule from a being who had ruled through conquest and calculated authority for centuries beyond her own lifetime. But the wary uncertainty of their first meeting had given way to something more nuanced, more genuinely collaborative. than either of them could have anticipated in the chaos of that first catastrophic arrival. It was on a quiet evening, weeks after the rift's closure, that Zelda found herself once more on the tower balcony, where so much of her uncertainty about the strange new world had first taken root, watching Nazarick's disciplined patrols move through the moonlit courtyards below with a familiarity that surprised her. "It's strange," she said when Link joined her, "how quickly the impossible becomes simply the way things are." "That a good thing?" Link asked, settling beside her at the balcony's edge. She considered the question carefully, thinking of the husks they'd found in the forest on their first day, of Shaltyr's terrible, casual power, of Ainz's careful, calculated authority that nonetheless carried genuine warmth beneath its surface. "I think," she said finally, "it means we're learning to see this world clearly, not as simply monstrous and not as simply safe, but as something considerably more complicated than either. The same as home in its own way. Just with different monsters and different reasons for hope." Far below, in the chamber housing the crystalline sphere, Ainz Ooal remained at his considerable work long into the night, poring over scrolls and reports that catalogued every fragment of information Nazarick's scholars had gathered regarding the nature of the boundary between worlds and the force that had sought to exploit it. The rift was sealed, the immediate crisis resolved, but the deeper mystery of what truly lay beyond the boundary, of what patient, ancient intelligence had orchestrated the collision of two worlds that should never have touched, remained stubbornly unsolved. And somewhere beyond the reach of even Nazarick's considerable magical sight, in a space that existed at the edges of both worlds' understanding, something ancient and patient continued its long, careful work, undeterred by a single failed attempt, already turning its attention toward the next pathway, the next opportunity, the next chance to claim what it had first sensed stirring the moment a Triforce mark had blazed to sudden, unexpected life in a field of Hyrulean grass beneath a golden, unsuspecting sky. What began as a catastrophic collision between two fundamentally incompatible worlds, one built on inherited courage and divine trust, the other forged through centuries of calculated conquest and hard-won order, ended not with domination, nor with a simple return home, but with something far rarer in stories of this kind: genuine mutual respect earned across weeks of doubt, conflict, and shared crisis. Zelda and Link arrived in the new world as anomalies, mistaken first for threats, then for prizes to be claimed by whichever faction moved quickest. What they became by the story's end was something Nazarick itself had rarely extended to outsiders: trusted allies woven into the fabric of a kingdom built on the premise that only strength could guarantee order. Their presence tested that premise in ways Ainz Ooal, for all his centuries of careful calculation, had not fully anticipated. Zelda's insistence on understanding motive before judgment, on questioning the cost behind Nazarick's order rather than simply accepting its results, pushed even a being of his experience toward a more considered accounting of what his kingdom's strength had truly cost, and what it might yet be worth protecting for reasons beyond simple conquest. Link's arc carried its own quiet weight. A hero accustomed to being the strongest blade in any given room found himself, for the first time in his experience, genuinely dwarfed by the powers surrounding him, and had to relearn, painfully and honestly, that his worth had never rested on being the strongest sword present, but on the unwavering courage to stand in harm's way regardless of the odds arrayed against him. That lesson, tested against Cocytus's blunt respect and nearly broken by a forged message designed to exploit exactly that insecurity, ultimately proved sturdier than any doubt planted against it. The Triforce, meanwhile, revealed itself as something considerably more significant than a coveted artifact. Its resonance with the Rift, its role in finally sealing the boundary against the Riftwalker's patient hunger, suggested a purpose that transcended Hyrule's borders entirely. A balancing force the multiverse itself perhaps had reason to call upon when boundaries meant to remain closed began quietly, dangerously to fray, and that thread the deeper mystery of what force first opened the rift, and why remains deliberately, purposefully unresolved. The Theocracy's aggression was answered. The Riftwalker's immediate threat was sealed away, but the patient intelligence that orchestrated the collision in the first place still waits, somewhere beyond the reach of even Nazarick's considerable sight, already calculating its next approach. What made this crossover work wasn't simply Ainz's overwhelming power meeting Hyrule's mythic weight, nor the spectacle of a guardian's duel or a sealed rift closing beneath golden light. It was the friction of two moral frameworks, one built on aspirational courage, the other on pragmatic order, refusing to simply dissolve into easy agreement, instead finding something more durable in the deliberate hard-won work of understanding each other's costs and reasons. Zelda never fully trusts Ainz. Ainz never fully abandons his ambition regarding the Triforce's potential. That unresolved tension is the story's real engine, not a flaw to be smoothed away. Nazarick had built its order through strength alone for centuries. Zelda and Link reminded it without ever saying so directly, that order sustained purely by fear eventually finds itself facing threats that fear alone cannot answer, and that sometimes, the rarest strength a kingdom can cultivate is the willingness to extend trust to strangers. Even when every calculated instinct advises otherwise, the rift is sealed. The alliance holds, however, cautiously. And somewhere in the vast dark beyond both their worlds' understanding, something ancient continues watching, patient enough to wait for the next crack in the boundary between what should never have touched, and what, against every reasonable expectation, found in each other something worth defending. The Triforce endures. Nazarick remembers. More stories await.